Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Deborah. It's just such a pleasure and such an honour to be here, and I am very grateful. I'm also very jet lagged, so you are right. It is a long distance. It's about 21 hours of flying time, so please excuse me if I do the odd little yawn. It's actually just jet lag. But it's a real pleasure to barely see you all today, and I've got a lot to tell you about. I know we have about 45 minutes, then we can continue chatting over, I hope, a glass of wine. But look, today I'm really excited and indeed honoured, so thank you, to speak with you about artists, about connectivity, and about curatorial practice in the aftermath of COVID. I hesitate, by the way, to say aftermath because, of course, we're still really in it. But there are many questions that I've thought about and discussed at length with my peers, with colleagues, during the global shutdowns of 2020 and 2021. Among them, how does one work responsibly and sustainably in the present moment? And how do we build genuine collaborative opportunities for our artists and our audiences within but also beyond our city centres? Now, as we've all experienced to varying degrees, the past 2+ years have been deeply challenging for the cultural sector and for communities the world over. Today, I wanted to talk about the creative community and how we rebuild, how we regain momentum, reconnect, exchange ideas, this being my first US trip in about 3 years, and importantly, to think about things differently and sustainably for a climate-challenged future. And of course, I note that it is absolutely pouring in Miami as we speak. I think you're all quite rained upon, and I was slightly shocked driving over the bridge over the water the other night and just seeing that king tide, which was incredibly high. So this is something you're all very familiar with. But Australia currently is in the throes of a very big, very flooded La Nina year. But I also wanted to speak more broadly and also quite personally in response to this invitation about curatorial practice and vision, about some of the art and artists that provide enormous inspiration for me, as well as the challenges of working within different institutional and geographical frameworks. So by way of background, until recently, I lived and worked in Sydney, Australia, and Melbourne before that. My training is in university art museums, collections, writing and research, and an early, very formative curatorial experience for me, in fact, was working with the respected artist and educator Fred Wilson, since a lifelong friend, on an exhibition, residency project and publication together. That was in 1999, and it had a huge impact. Following this, I worked for many years at the Museum of Contemporary Art, or MCA Australia, which is just here in the images. I'm sure you can tell it's Sydney because of the Harbour Bridge, but it is the only large-scale contemporary collecting institution in the country with a local and international exhibitions program of very significant scale and remit. So those curatorial projects, and often very long-standing relationships with artists, they stay with me today. And I'll share some images with you in a moment just to flesh them out a little bit more. Some of these projects also travelled to the US and to Canada and to different parts of the Asian region. And one highlight, for example, and Dennis, you touched on that, was of course the opportunity to work with Yinka Shonibare on a career survey in 2010, the 50th year of Nigerian independence, which travelled from Sydney and Auckland to the Brooklyn Museum and the National Museum of African Art in Washington, DC. That was an incredible experience with Yinka. So I'll just click this forward. Yep. It's doing its clicking refusal. Let's give it one more go. Oh, there we go. So I concluded my role as Chief Curator at the MCA in 2021, right amidst the COVID-19 shutdowns, to take on a new challenge as CEO of a public, national, not-for-profit cultural and environmental trust named Bundanon. It's located on the south coast of New South Wales in a remote bush location, approximately 2.5 hours, sometimes 3 hours, south of Sydney, and I do encourage you to visit or join our artistic residency program in the future. You'll see why in a little while, as Dennis has alluded to. So from city to region, established and recognised to new and environmentally vulnerable, Bundanon being within a high-risk bushfire and flood zone, this has been a journey that both inspires and challenges me daily, but it also opens up new site-responsive ways of thinking and working with artists across disciplines that address sustainability, climate change, community, and connection very directly. Now, I often ask myself when speaking about creative practice, whether art making or curatorial, why do we do what we do, and how do we add meaning and purpose to our lives beyond the everyday? I feel incredibly fortunate and humbled by the opportunity to work in a sector founded on ideas, on exchange, connection, and of course, questions. Because for me, the key is curiosity. That's my favourite word. Curiosity about our world, about different ways of seeing and exploring it, of making sense, or not, of its complexity, confronting honestly, indeed painfully, its failures, but ultimately connecting with people and stories that have value and meaning. So this is one of the many reasons I love working with contemporary practice, with artists and makers today, because it opens up a dialogue or a sharing of ideas. It's not a one-way street. And to this day, those conversations continue to surprise, inspire, disturb, challenge, and educate me. Another important art and life lesson for me has been to learn to listen, something I'm not doing right now because I'm having to talk. But for any curator, I'd suggest it's not just important, but necessary to step back, observe, take a pause, allow for silence, and operate with grace. But for now, allow me to share some images with you, as I'm very passionate about working with and supporting the work of artists today to ensure they reach a wide and engaged public, and of course supporting the production of new work as well as retrospective projects. Now, in the interests of time, sadly, I've only selected a very small handful of curatorial projects to share today, so Dennis, I apologise. I have many images I can show you on my phone later if you like. But what I thought I would focus on is 3 projects by 3 powerful women, all of which encompass substantial bodies of work across painting, performance, objects, and installations. So these are some of my curatorial projects at the MCA Australia, and then I'll share some final images with you of the new Bundanon adventure before closing. So I thought I'd start with Yoko Ono, and this is a work of hers, perhaps an unexpected one. But Yoko is an artist I've admired for many years, and I had the opportunity to collaborate with her on a career retrospective in 2013 to 2014. Developing a project that encompassed her instructional works and the conceptual objects of the 1960s through to the large-scale installations of the 1990s, 2000s, and new performative works. I wanted to work with Yoko for many reasons, but primarily because I felt that as an artist, she was surprisingly little known and under-recognised, something I hope may have changed by her MoMA exhibition since, although of course that was just focused on the 1 decade only. And one thing I do believe is that it's really important to recognise an artist's practice across the duration of time in which they work. One of the most important aspects for curatorial practice for me is really collaboration. So building a project together, often through years-long conversations about art, about ideas, about meaning, and of course imagination. So an important part of that conversation with Yoko was travelling to Hiroshima in 2011, for whom the devastating impact of war and all wars forms a recurrent theme, counterbalanced by stillness, reflection, mind expansion, and of course play. There were a lot of interactive projects in that exhibition. I don't have images of them here today, but you had people building things, making things, playing games of chess, and doing all sorts of things together. So it was a really quite a tactile exhibition in many ways. But I'll move on. So allow me now to share the work of another artist, perhaps one that some of you haven't encountered before, although Dennis and Deborah, I know you know this work really well. And her name is Gulumbu Yunapingu, a painter of stars and epic human narratives associated with the constellations of Pleiades and Orion. Now, Mrs. Yunapingu lived and worked in northeast Arnhem Land, which is in the Northern Territory of Australia, and she painted on bark panels and larrakitch or memorial poles, traditionally a secondary interment for ancestral bones. You can see the panels on the back wall, the larrakitch in the middle. To the far right, there is the work of a Chinese-Australian artist named Lindy Lee as well. Now, Mrs. Yunapingu's art career encompassed roughly a decade, prefaced by her work as a healer and a translator, a community leader and a respected elder. Her father and mother were significant for her art. The former giving access to the particular stories that shaped her work, and the latter an understanding of the night sky and its glittering stars as an ever-watchful, protective web enveloping the globe, regardless of location or culture. Now I'll just go back one. No, it's going the wrong way. Can we go back? Can we go back one, please? Thank you. Okay. If you look closely at this image, I hope you'll see that there's a small dot at the centre of every star, which is a reference to rain, or in her mother's words, the stars crying. I mentioned the importance of listening and likewise allowing for silence, space, and time in conversation just before. This is really a learning from Mrs. Yunapingu, and equally from time spent with senior women in the Kimberley region of Australia, some of the greatest artists in the world today. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to share a recent project which concluded with the onset of devastating bushfires across Australia's east coast, followed by flooding, then COVID-19. Interestingly, perhaps coincidentally or not, Cornelia Parker's work is all about pulling things apart, breaking them down, flattening and crushing them, exploding them, then suspending them in a marvellous dreamlike state. Among them, silver vessels and cutlery from Britain's bygone age of empire are steamrolled into one-dimensional oblivion. An ordinary garden shed and all its contents are exploded with Semtech. I don't think you'd get away with that today. A psychological minefield of the things that we accumulate but cannot quite throw away. Combining drama and suspense, curiosity and play, these works speak to a world in constant turmoil, and unfortunately one which doesn't learn from its mistakes. Hence this work, War Room, which among other things alludes to the war tent in which the British and French kings sought unsuccessfully to negotiate peace, not battle. One of the lovely things about this work, and you can probably see it looking at the top, is that it's long red ribbons of paper with perforations. It's actually the offcuts from one of the factories in the UK that manufactures remembrance poppies. You know, the red poppies that you buy and wear on your lapel for the 11th of November. So this is the kind of empty holes or marks left once the poppies are punched out by the machine. But before we move on, I want to talk a little bit more about COVID-19, about studio visits and commissioning of new work, and what that meant personally as a curator in Australia, a place some of you might think is light years away, yet separated only by a rather wide stretch of ocean. As I said, 21 hours on a plane. For as the world ground to an extended halt and the crisis mounted, The operation of museums paused, but the work of artists did not. Jobs were lost, loved ones became ill, family members died, and funerals were watched on screen, online and remotely. We lost a dear friend, a wonderful Australian artist, Kate Dorr, to breast cancer amidst this. Yet another memorial online. This one attended by 500 people remotely, including artists she'd taught, artists she'd mentored from around Australia, India, Scotland, and beyond. This will make you laugh. Oh, there we go. But work continued from the living room and from my armchair. Here it is, a strangely intimate experience with people seeing into others' lives via a screen. How lucky I'd tidied up and done some basic house painting just before the shutdowns. You can see Yinka's book actually in the background there and an LP by Yoko. But unable to travel, let alone go out for months, like everybody else, I began to roam the world on screen, organising studio visits in Iran, in Iraq, in Berlin, the Netherlands, and Argentina. I worked away on a beautiful big survey of contemporary Australian art with my colleagues around Sydney and steered through a major painting commission by the powerful female artist Betty Kuntiwa Pumani from the South Australian region known as APY Lands and a community in the southeast called Mimili. Fortunately, a large supply of canvas was delivered to Mimili one day, literally one day, before the closures saw the community locked down for about 1 year. So Betty painted every day, 6 or 7 days a week for 5 months, creating a masterwork 10 metres in length and 3 metres in height of her mother's country, Antara, and the stories of Maku, the witchetty grub. I'll just show you one more image for scale with Betty. There you go. It is an absolutely huge work and a completely stunning work. We were fortunate to exhibit the work at the MCA in between 2 COVID closures. Then I worked with my colleagues to raise funds for its acquisition into the MCA collection, where it now lives unstretched once more in 2 large rolled sections awaiting its next display. It's so large you actually can't get it through the doors of the galleries, so it has to be stretched on site, installed, taken down, taken off its stretcher, and so forth. But in this painting, you'll see the deep red earth of Antara, the bright blue rock holes filled with freshly fallen rainwater after extended drought, another manifestation of climate change, and a thick white stipple, or tobacco flowers, flowering across the landscape after the rain. It's really beautiful. Mimili Maku, the art centre where Betty works, made a short video during this period to document her progress on the work, because of course no one could travel. It's only a minute or 2, and I'll share it with you at the end of this presentation so you have a sense of the production, the scale, and also the relationship to country. But to conclude my talk today, I'd like to speak a little more about the new Art and Life chapter that is Bundanon, a word meaning deep valley in the Darawal First Nations language. So Bundanon is situated on a mighty river called the Shoalhaven in South Coast New South Wales, and it's very big. It encompasses 1,000 hectares of land, including pristine bush, or you might say forest, floodplains, agricultural and parklands. Let's see if I can get this up. Okay, classified as a wildlife refuge, with bush regeneration and First Nations-led land care practices sitting alongside creative and educational programs, it is quite an extraordinary place with over 20 endangered species and diverse biohabitats. Despite the dramatic beauty of its natural setting though, as I mentioned, it sits at the epicentre of a high-risk fire and flood zone. Now, Bundanon was gifted to the nation in 1993 by an artist named Arthur Boyd and his wife Yvonne, who you see here. It supports a creative residency program for visual and performing artists, for literature, music and dance, as well as day and residential stay school programs accommodated in the Boyd Education Centre, which is a really, really lovely building. And it is the only Pritzker Prize-winning building in Australia, designed by an architect named Glenn Murcutt, who some of you may know. Now, Bundanon's residency program welcomes 250 to 300 artists every year on site, accommodated in residential cottages in the bush for 1, 2, or 3 weeks at a time. The residencies offer immersion in nature for the purpose of creating new work, and the site at night is uninterrupted by artificial light, noise, and traffic, offering instead a really quiet place for contemplation, creativity, and engagement with landscape. One of the things I love the most about Bundanon is in fact the night sky, because you've never seen such a great view of stars. I'm just showing you here too one of our rather magnificent views. I did mention the Shoalhaven River. It's quite big, and this is where saltwater and freshwater meet on the river, so it's not far from the coast. Now, I've got some quite funny photos to show you. They're straight off my phone, so they're quite informal. But in December 2021, 6 months after my arrival, we completed a major new build, encompassing a purpose-built art museum and collection store, a bridge for creative learning, and a large hospitality and accommodation suite. We can actually sleep 96 people on the property. Now, arriving part-way through the process, oh, another nice view first. There we go. Arriving partway through the process amidst COVID and steering it through to completion was, I have to say, a big challenge. Construction workers were limited. We at one point went from over 100 to about 42 people, at which point we started working 7 days a week to try and complete this very large job. Glass codes changed halfway through the process, and you'll see one image where there's just open holes in the front of the art museum because it took months to get the right glass manufactured during COVID. We had to move a massive water tank from one location to another, necessitating the excavation of an entire hill and much more. I'll show you a few more pictures. The build's architect, Kirsten Thompson, struggled to access the site, driving several times from Melbourne in between shutdowns, about 10 hours of driving each way. There you go. That's our bridge. Yep, and there's me in the hard hat. Oh, and there is the art museum with no windows for a very long time. And there's a gallery in construction. Now, Bundanon opened its doors publicly early this year in the wake of extensive flooding across the east coast of Australia, which saw our launch programs cancelled. I can't tell you what a sad day that was, but here you have it. Flooded car parks, flooded cars, can we go back one? Can we go back one, please? Oh, okay. And of course, a flooded concert stage, which I have to say was very, very painful. We'd planned this incredible First Nations-led and produced festival, and that was a tough... now it's going backwards. We'd put together a First Nations-led and produced festival, which to cancel was deeply upsetting, but I wrote to each of the 42 groups, participants, explained our situation of the flooding, which everybody else was basically in. And what we did do was make a commitment over the next 12 months to program each person, each performance, each group. So I have to say there is always a silver lining in situations that are really challenging like this. I threw in one picture of a tree. It's a really, really big tree, but I just wanted to give you an idea of scale and complexity in terms of this site, because when it floods, really big trees come down. The man in that image is about 6'2". He's really big, and he's tiny in that tree, and that's one of upwards of 30 to 40 trees we've had to take out since the beginning of the year because of the floods. Anyway, let me tell you the good news now, because it does get better. There we go. Oh, This thing is jumping. Thank you. So situated quite literally on the precipice of climate change, our new art museum and bridge are designed in response to fire and flood mitigation, the former embedded into a protective hillside and the latter straddling a flood valley below. So you can see, when you see the art museum there, the only side that is actually visible is the front facade. The other three sides, the roof, they're all embedded within a hill. I'll show you a few more quite pretty pictures, and you can see the bridge just adjacent. Environmental sustainability is at the core of this new build, with solar panels running the length of the 160 metres long bridge. Its deep corrugations that you can see in the image capture rainwater, and they service the wider site, whilst a geothermal system cools the art museum, reducing the need for air conditioning to a minimum. By way of example, I'm sure you probably know that art museums, which have collections, they're huge consumers of fossil fuels because you have to air condition your collection for perpetuity. Because we use a geothermal system, which involves cooling rods embedded within the hillside, and because the art museum sits within a hill, which is nice and cool anyway, we use probably 30 to 40% of the standard air conditioning you would need for an art museum. Our carbon footprint is thus low, and no fossil fuels are used on our bridge or in our kitchen, which runs off electric power, no gas, which I have to say was a little bit of a shock when the chefs first arrived and there was no flame to work with. Other than this, we do maintain 2 carbon forests on site, and we work with the local First Nations custodians on annual cool temperature cultural burns when the weather permits to manage our fire risk. Now, despite our federal status, operational funding is currently minimal, and this is something I'm working hard to redress with the recent change in Australia's political leadership. So interesting times are ahead. I'll show you a few more beautiful images. I love all these images when it lights up at night and just glows very softly in the landscape. But there are many things that make this nascent organisation unique, and something of a blueprint I'd suggest, or a template for the cultural sector going forwards, from its low carbon footprint and significant environmental work to the ways in which it engages with local and First Nations communities, a relationship that is embedded and strengthening as we grow and learn. It offers an end-to-end experience for artists of all disciplines, because now it provides the opportunity to create new work then presented in the new art museum and the wider landscape. It sets out a new kind of paradigm, reflecting a shift away from the urban envelope to something deeper, more experiential, and more site-responsive, that sits intuitively, I think, in response to our changed times. Isn't that beautiful? That's a flood gully. So when it floods, which it has 3 times since January, all the water goes rushing through that gully and it pools further below. I have to say, having had 3 major floods on site, the new buildings have held up really, really well. We didn't quite expect to have to test them so rigorously and so soon, but again, there is climate change and there is La Niña. So curatorially, this project also allows for different kinds of engagement with artists. My own practice has shifted to accommodate the wider leadership of the organisation, and it supports the work of a small but highly skilled curatorial team. Now, before we conclude, do allow me to share a couple of images from the opening program, which reflect in different ways the materiality of the site, its history and its connection to country in relation to the Dharawal and Durga language groups. I'm just going to click through a few images for you now. There is, of course, the river in the background, and the curve of the river is really what you see in our kind of S-shaped logo. And you can see that the site involves historical cottages, as well as the Boyd Education Centre, as well as the new connecting breezeway, the new bridge and the new art museum. So it's really a kind of conglomeration of buildings and spaces. And I think it's really pretty at dusk. And in case you're wondering, yes, there are kangaroos and there are wombats. And I had a photo of a wombat and I didn't put it in, and I'm regretting that. I thought it would be too cheesy, but I'm sure you would have loved it. I'll show you later. If anyone wants to see it, remind me, because it's on my phone. This, I think, is the loveliest of the images. I'll show you a couple of images of the interior now as an art museum. As I said, we work in a really interdisciplinary way, so you have dancers and choreographers, you have visual artists, you have musicians, filmmakers, videographers, and so on, writers, poets, and so forth. This is the scale of the galleries. You can see, because it's embedded within a hill, it follows the slope or the line of the hill from 7 metres down to 5. And on the right, you'll see a series of slender shelves upon which we slowly, over a period of 3 months, built up a series of hand-woven bowls, working with First Nations elders, particularly a man called Uncle Stephen Russell. In front of this image here, it's an image of beautiful ceramic works made using clay from Bundanon's site. And there were a number of other works too, using fibre plant materials from the site, including an incredible ngawi or canoe made from bark on the property. This is one of the baskets. And I'll just show you a few images of the making of the baskets. That's Uncle Stephen Russell on the left. So as we conclude tonight's presentation, and I think I'm right on time, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and share with you the short video that I mentioned before, filmed with Betty Pumani during the lockdown period. I just feel like it's a fitting note to end on, because it's inspiring, it's powerful, and it captures all of the reasons I believe that art is so integral to our lives and our stories today. So thank you. Just get you to pop the video on.
Campus, Portugal, 10 kilometers. Kodara. Finding male Fayano, Porno Cocho, Rasuia. I Fayano for 5 months for Chukorba, training Makodara. Mana kami ko chamu Chukorba, Polka, Mako, Polka. Ragal Polka, Kadanatari by Amquaru, heritage, long time. The Koka and Wari, and Lachis Kabi, and then Wakadiri, finding Amquaru, and Lachis throw the Avujoda, Kabi, or Mako Jodari, lots of Mako, and Sarali and Nakoli, Arna Yulanko.
Thank you.